Spiderhead is an extremely modern prison that resembles a luxury hotel. Here, prisoners live in a more comfortable order, wander outside, interact with each other, and they can get the chance to reduce their penalties. However, all this has a price. Medical experiments are carried out in this facility and not all innocent. To be fair, all experiments are based on a voluntary basis. And it should be noted that prisoners can refuse at any time and transfer to another prison. Ray, one of the prisoners, sits on the chair in front of a mirrored glass and Steve starts the experiment by injecting a substance into his vein. After a minute, the first dose of drug is applied on the subject and simple jokes begin to be said. This leads to Ray's relentless laughter. Even when the jokes are replaced by pessimistic facts, the experiment remains the same. Ray continues with laughter. Another morning in Spiderhead is no different from the previous morning. The prisoners are awakened with a speaker and their names are announced to join the experiments immediately. Steve asks Jeff if he wants to try his new Kirk compound, which no one has tried before, and accepts the Jeff to join the experiment. In addition to the test medication, another substance that strengthens the speech centers of the brain is applied. This allows Jeff to define the situation in great detail, chanting even the smallest details. On his way back to Spiderhead, he meets Jeff Lizzie and talks about his walk that day. Unfortunately, he cannot fully explain what he sees because a side effect occurs after receiving the substance that strengthens the vocabulary. Jeff can't even say a few words. The only thing he remembers is that everything around him during the experiment, whether flowers or factory pipes, it arouses a strong sense of love and admiration. While sitting in the bed in the evening, Jeff remembers how he went to jail. They decide to go to the party with his friend and the drunk Jeff goes to the steering wheel. The next day, Kirk attempts, called Cupids, continue. However, this time Jeff is not alone. Heather is a brave girl who changes her mind about her partner just a few seconds after the drug is applied and is invited to join her. The couple's conversation lasts for a few seconds, then they cannot stand and they have a sincere relationship. They are not even aware that they are observed and withdrawn. Because matter has completely broken its minds from internal obstacles. The experiment ends when young people admit their love to each other. This pleases Steve and asks his partner Mark to observe how the subjects will behave after the effects of the substance. After the couple, he feels strange and tries not to talk to anyone. Jeff continues to spend his free time with Lizzie. He does not tell him what happened during the experiments and avoids encounters with Heather. The same Cupid medication is applied to Jeff the next day as a double dose and instead of Heather. There is an old woman in the room. The non-drunk Jeff looks at the woman with disgust. However, when it enters the blood of matter, love begins to feed feelings of love. After this experiment, Jeff asks Lizzie to leave the kitchen they work with, because he is uncomfortable with continuing to interact with his girlfriend. Steve takes Jeff to the laboratory. However, this time it is located on the other side of the glass. Steve shows Jeff that two previous partners are in the experimental room. The supervisor asks Jeff the effect of the girl who wants to practice the effect of intense fear and pain, but Jeff cannot make a choice. Both girls do not care and do not want to harm them. Finally, they only release the girls and cancel the experiment. Jeff, who has the right to walk on Friday, calls his girlfriend with him the night of the accident. However, it only reaches the voice message. In the evening, Jeff spends time with Lizzie and decides to prepare a small Christmas surprise. When Jeff finds herself in the familiar chair in the laboratory, she sees Robin, a large prisoner covered with tattoos. Jeff remembers everything he lived with girls in previous days, and rejects the experiment. Nothing happens and the men are released after a few minutes of silence. Jeff understands what is happening. He and Robin is a partner with a prisoner, and he should decide which of these women will take medicine. When he sees Heather there, he confirms that his doubts are correct. Moreover, the doctor does not even argue with the prisoner. On the contrary, it presents a diagram that shows who to get closer to whom under the influence of the drug. In response to Jeff's complaints, Steve reminds him that being in Spiderhead is a privilege. And if he's not satisfied, he says he can transfer to an ordinary prison, but he can do it without the chance to evacuate early. Jeff, who understands the clue, next time he sits calmly with Robin in the same room, without showing any symptoms of anger. Steve tells Mark to go on a weekend holiday and advises him to spend time on the mainland with his friend. Steve. He starts to take Cupid himself to experience the euphoria he had seen only in his subjects. The experiments continue and Steve reports that Jeff should be applied to girls, because a committee demands the purity of the experiment. Jeff tries to explain the effects of these substances independently of their feelings for girls that they do not want anyone to live. However, Steve insistently returns from his decision and talks about all the privileges he has gained in cooperation with Jeff. Jeff, who does not want to go back to an ordinary prison, accepts the herds of Heather. Heather begins to cry in panic. However, the management calmly records the data and listens to Jeff's interpretations of romantic emotions. The goal of the experiment is realized and Steve plans to end the experiment, but it becomes a mistake and loses Heather control. He gets a sharp object to get rid of the blackened herds. While dealing with Steve and Mark Heather, Jeff realizes the lost switches of the supervisor and a notebook with the records of the upcoming experiments, and finds a lottery ticket with the names of the drugs applied. Seeing Steve is no longer behind the glass, Jeff manages to lock the safe and threw back the switches and does not realize that the doctor's secret is revealing. If anyone learns about the brand Heather, he warns that everyone in the experiment will sink together. Lizzie joins the experiments for the first time, and the first thing that is applied to it is the darkened herds. After experiencing the experiment, he meets Jeff in a secluded place and shares his feelings with him. As Lizzie is better than an ordinary prison with the most strict regime, Lizzie is better. He admits that he is not sure. Jeff also opens to his girlfriend and says that he is not just a friend in the car, but he has a lover and died that night. Therefore, he explains that he voluntarily participated in experiments in the hope of having to forgive his guilt. This conversation leads them to spend the night together. Steve quickly notices their close relationship, and he decides to use this connection for his own purposes. When Jeff arrives for the next experiment, he accepts the herds that darkened Lizzie today, or learns that he should be separated from Spiderhead. Jeff rejects, but the doctor gives him the opportunity to postpone the experiment in the morning. When he meets again with resistant young man, Steve holds Lizzie's personal file. The reason why the girl is in prison is so terrible that none of the blackened herds can make her worse. Steve pleasure with the maximum of Jeff's dosage. But soon after that, Jeff's main purpose is not to his girlfriend, but to experiment with him. Mark decides to correct the situation by realizing that both he and his prisoners have fallen into Steve's trap and gives the control device to Jeff. The prisoner receives all the necessary information from Steve and convinces him to open the main output to leave Lizzie and he can get out of prison. However, the manager holds the control device in the hands of the maximum dose of the herds that are darkening to leave the girl in pain. Then so no one can cancel his command. It breaks the mobile phone. The couple manages to get rid of the effects of drugs and escape from the laboratory. Steve at the same time, all other prisoners will be sent to old prisons due to fugitives via the speaker. And there explains that their comfortable lives will end. Jeff and Lizzie become the target of a great chase, including a few criminals, including a huge tattooed Rogan. It plans to stop this pair, which takes all the privileges in the facility. When Steve learns that Mark's police boots are about to approach Spiderhead, he decides to take the medication and escape. Steve manages to leave the base and ride a small plane before the police arrive. However, since the control device is disintegrated, the drugs are injected into the body in large amounts. Another oscillation of Cupid creates a sense of admiration for him and directs the plane to a small rock island he sees as a paradise. Mark watches on the police boat on the sea of his old boss and then crashes into the rocks. Jeff and Lizzie take over a boat and the cops manage to escape before they arrive. The young couple, who is happy and free, thinks that their only regret is that Steve does not invented a substance that cannot forgive him, and the film ends.